Great. Well, good morning or afternoon to you. My name is Bill Kimmel, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a moment. Before we get started, I want to do a very quick introduction to our company. Sat and I work for ThoughtWorks. We're a global consultancy that focuses on writing enterprise software for our clients. We also help them with advice and consulting. And we also write products for the software industry that help you write the best software you can in the most agile way possible. So we're a worldwide company. We started in Chicago in the US, and we've grown over the last 10, 12 years internationally. We're about 2,000 people now. So we've worked for various retailers both in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and I'm not sure if we've done any work in China in the retail industry, but I know we have in India as well. Let's go to the next one here, and let's introduce ourselves. Sat, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi everybody. I'm Sat Vijayaraghavan. I have about 17 years of experience. Been working with retailers for almost a decade now. Helped several Fortune 100 retailers with their IT strategy. Helping build out a much more agile and responsive business, and that's kind of what we'll be talking about today. Bill, why don't you introduce yourself?
Great, thank you. And Sat neglected to mention that he actually has I think you have the longest name in the company, not your first name, but your last name. So I just thought that was important somehow to mention. So my name is Bill Kimmel. I've worked at ThoughtWorks for about 15 years and worked with a variety of US and European retailers during this time. I live in Chicago, and it's going to be at 100 degrees here today. And actually, the last time I checked, my local Home Depot still has air conditioners for sale. So good job to Home Depot for managing their supply chain and making sure they have enough product in stock. So good on them. All right, so let's move along. And Sat, tell me, why this topic? Why are we talking about this?
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for the question. Retail at this point in time is undergoing one of the most disruptive phases ever, right? And if you kind of look at it historically, right from 1950s, the evolution of retail has been gradual in nature. So retailers have almost always had a period of time for them to adjust and adapt to what's happening in the market. Whether it was a migration from a stores or catalog-based retailing to malls to e-commerce, and from e-commerce onto mobile commerce. But after 2007-2008 timeframe, there have been a series of successive changes in adoption of technology by consumers that's forced the way that retailing is operating, whether it's social commerce, the influence of social media on retailing, whether it's digital display-based commerce, whether it's tablet commerce, and so on. And the list keeps going on in an endless fashion. And that's kind of causing retailers to adjust the way that they operate in ways that they have never had to do before. And that's one of the largest challenges that the industry is facing at this point in time.
Okay, so I think something else we need to
Absolutely. So, Bill, we spoke about the need for being agile and responsive and so on. So, what are retailers doing about the need for being innovative, disruptive, and so on? So, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, the way I look at it is everyone talks about innovation. It's an incredibly popular topic, and it's really hard to do. That said, in order to be innovative, it's a good thing to strive for, and some companies are really good at it. Apple's really good at it. But one thing you actually have to have in order to be innovative is actually you need to be able to be responsive to the market. So that's an even more important challenge. You can't really be innovative unless you're able to respond and adapt to things changing around you. It's very, very hard to predict the future. So far more important to be able to respond. So that's basically one of the themes we're going to talk through today.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the elements impacting agility, right? So if you kind of take a look at it, there are 4 broad categories of elements or areas that impact a retailer and the need to be agile. The first is consumer behavior, and this has undergone pretty rapid shifts, in terms of going from, going to the malls and shopping to using online as a medium of, shopping to the types of demography that's actually using mobile or, online to actually shop, and we'll discuss this in a little bit more. The second big aspect is around competitive threats and how retailers need to be a lot more responsive in terms of understanding what competitors are doing and respond to it appropriately and accurately. And this is gaining a greater significance with globalization. The third is regulation, regulatory aspects. It's to do with what are the laws being passed by government. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. The effects of laws that are being passed in other parts of the world that would impact, U.S. retailers and so on. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The fourth element is more around how operations are run and, what types of things that retailers need to watch out for when, retailers are trying to either optimize their supply chain or become more responsive back to customer needs. So those are the 4 big areas that we would talk about in the need for retailers to adapt and adjust to, what's happening in the market around them to be able to sense it and evolve their strategies in the right direction.
Okay, well, let's move to the first one then. So, obviously there's a lot of change in social and mobile over the last, 5, 10 years, mobile especially the last 2, 3 years. So it's a bit more than that, I think. I mean, it's there's certainly a lot of changes there, but you've got, the economy, you've got a bunch of other things going on.
Absolutely, Bill. So, social mobile definitely, they are changing the way that customers are operating and the way customers are shopping with the retailer. So we'll talk about some of them. And primarily, I will deal this through examples. So let's take, Pinterest as an example, right? 6 months or 8 months ago, they were not even on the radar of most retailers. And now they are the second most influential, social media channel that drives sales back to retailers. Similarly, mobile shopping the last holiday season, about 30% of customers use mobiles to actually make their purchase. That's changed significantly from just a few years back when not even 10% of customers were using mobile for their shopping. Another demographic shift is women actually spending more time. About 70% of purchases are made by women traditionally in a store, and that's actually now moved on to online as well. And women are actually shopping more than men online more often, and they are spending more as well. So that basic demography, the basic ways through which you shop is undergoing a lot of change. But that's enough said about mobile, and social, right? So let's take a look at some of the other aspects. More consumers, more often than not, consumers are now researching what they need to buy, how they need to make their purchase. They walk into a store, take a look at what products are on offer. They take a look at the pricing, flip out their mobile phones, and compare it against pricing from Amazon and so on. This is typically called the showrooming effect in the industry. And retailers are actually combating it in a number of different mechanisms. Some of the retailers that I've been working with have used strategies to, not make price and apples to apples comparison. So they have been trying to use loyalty as mechanisms to fight, the showrooming effect. So essentially what this does is basically polarize the customer base, where the cherry pickers who actually impact margins negatively are being driven to, retailers like Amazon whereas the customers that spend more with a retailer are rewarded much better. They have more personalized discounts, and retailers are now getting to a point where they are not only targeting the personas, and usually that used to be the way customer segments were evolved, but they're moving away from a persona-based retailing down to the level of an individual and trying to figure out their specific buying behavior, purchasing patterns, and targeting specific promotions through a number of different mediums and channels, and trying to drive greater customer loyalty that way. That's an example of how consumer behavior is changing a fundamental shift in the way that retailers operate. Let's talk a little bit more about the economy effect, right? So the 2008 economy, different categories of retailing did see pressure, but the more luxury and the high-end retail, fashion, apparel, and so on, did not see as much of a downtrend. Right, drugs and grocery have always been resilient in a downward economy, but the luxury segment definitely did not see as much of an effect, in terms of their sales numbers and so on, as is 2012, where the entire spectrum of retailing is actually seeing significant challenges. This is not only due to local effect, but it's also due to what's happening in Eurozone, and what's happening in the rest of the world as well in terms of the way that economy is moving. So that's that's how globalized we are at this point in time. Another example is what's kind of happening in Brazil. The economy is red hot. The needs of consumers are underserved there. So consumers are actually finding it cheaper to book a flight to US, go over to Miami, and make purchases out there. So the economy effect is just not local. It's a lot more global, and retailers need to anticipate that fact and adjust to it as well. The same with Australian retailing, where consumers are finding it much more cheaper due to local laws to actually order from Amazon or order from the US and get it shipped to their house in Australia. So that's so very different in terms of retailing, and the concept of retailing is undergoing a big shift.
All right. So what presentation isn't complete with a picture of some sprinters wearing high heels or suits? So what are the big threats? Amazon has clearly been a big player the last 10 years. Walmart certainly reducing the price point. What are the big threats out there?
Sure. So a lot of retailers, primarily in the grocery general merchandise segment, not as much in fashion and apparel today, but that's undergoing a change as well. But definitely in the grocery and general merchandise segments, need to be keenly aware. In fact, there's a retailer that I'm currently working with. They are under pressure from Amazon, and you typically think, why would a grocery retailer be under pressure from Amazon, and seeing a shift in the customer base going towards Amazon? And the reason is Amazon, about 60% of a grocer's revenue is, or 50 to 60%, large part of the revenue is actually driven by non-perishable items, by non-food items, and so on. And this is an area that Amazon's playing. So even at a grocery level, grocers are seeing a shift. Another retailer that I'm working with in Europe, was seeing a dip in their sales in stores in certain categories, trying to figure out what's causing the shift and so on. Turns out there were category killers that were popping up around these, in certain neighborhoods, in certain areas of that part of Europe, that were taking sales away. So it's really important for retailers to kind of sense what's happening from a competitive standpoint, and this includes merchandise mix, this includes specific prices, and so on. An example is for the retailer that I just mentioned, we got down their pricing from about, for them to be able to understand that a competitor has changed their price to the time when it actually takes, for them to reflect pricing changes into their stores. It used to take 3 weeks. Using a lot more of the agile techniques and the way that we deliver software, we were able to get that time down to, intraday. And that allowed them, allowed the retailer such a great responsive mechanism where they were able to understand what was happening in their competitors, feed it back into their intelligent decision-making processes, and out down into the retail stores. And this was done intraday if it was required, typically at the end of the day as a normal operating procedure. So this is a great example of how leveraging technology can actually impact business in a pretty significant manner, as an example of meeting competitive threats.
Agree. I think that's a great example of the world is moving a lot faster, and the sooner you can get changes into the stores. I mean, websites or the .com platform for all retailers, are generally pretty quick nowadays, but it's the stores that are often lagging. That's a great example. All right.
So let's talk a little bit about sustained innovation and disruptive innovation, right? So, the disruptive innovation typically happens, there is a point, there's a good amount of time that kind of elapses when the industry fundamentally changes. And that's kind of what defines disruptive innovation. So even for this Amazon effect to happen, it took about, close to a decade for online retailing to catch up. Similarly, Groupon, when they came in, 2007-8 timeframe, it took a while for the flash sale as a concept to catch on, and or the daily deals and so on to catch on, and it takes its own time. That happens once in a while. Retailers do need to respond to it. But what's more important is for retailers to respond to sustained innovation, right? There are several retailers that are classic examples here. So let's compare a couple of apparel retailers, Kohl's and JCPenney. JCPenney was way ahead of Kohl's in the online commerce space. They had reached $1 billion in sales well before Kohl's did. In fact, Kohl's at that time was, I think, about $100 million in e-commerce revenues. And, through sustained innovation in terms of, better payment mechanisms, better fulfillment options, greater visibility to orders, enhanced experience of the customer, through incremental innovation, the ability to serve multiple, demographics, expanding their product, assortments and so on. So Kohl's was able to effectively, come back with JCPenney, and they increased their share in the market to almost at a point where they are currently overtaking JCPenney in online revenues. A great story of sustained innovation in a single, aspect of retailing that was able to position the retailer and compete effectively with another one that was way ahead in the game. And that's kind of what sustained innovation can do for a retailer.
All right, so what kind of regulations are we talking about here? I mean, the big ones in the U.S. are, the healthcare law. That's going to have an impact on a lot of people. What kind of impact is that going to have on retailers? And, there's always the buzz around state sales tax for retailers. What's coming up?
So let's talk about those two, and then we'll talk about a couple of others that are happening around the world, but that would have an impact on U.S. retailing as well. So from the healthcare law that was recently passed and is being debated pretty heavily by both sides of the aisle, basically the law is supposed to provide greater guarantee and healthcare benefits to workers. And this typically impacts retailers that have more than 50 employees. Most retailers do, other than mom and pop shops and so on. So, what this basically means is now the employers or retailers need to pay a lot more and would, for their healthcare, for their worker benefits and so on. And that, puts greater pressure on an already, in a segment that's already facing stiff challenges. A natural response for most retailers is to be able to cut, is to cut their workforce down to minimize, the impact that they are kind of seeing. So a law that was meant to actually provide greater worker compensation negatively impacts retailing in terms of their bottom line, and it actually negatively impacts the end worker that was supposed to benefit from the change in laws. And that's one of the reasons why, there is both sides of the house are actually in agreement on, fighting this bill. That being said, that's an example of how, when some of these laws are enacted, it's important for retailers to understand the true meaning of the law, what it means to their bottom lines, and so on. I'll give you another example. This is Article 62 that's, recently enacted in Europe. And this has to do with, retailers having to pay their, their suppliers in 30 days. Earlier, it used to vary anywhere between 90 days to 180 days. The reason the law was introduced was for the debt to come down and for retailers to tighten their operations. Not just retailers, for companies to tighten their operations. So the introduction of this law, though it seems to hit financials and cash flow in the first instance, has a much more far-reaching effect back into their global supply chain. And when I say global supply chain, it goes all the way from, selecting of products to getting them onto the shelves in the right quantity, in the right time, and so on. And this has far-reaching effects, right? So once cash flow starts getting impacted, a natural effect is to minimize the inventory that a retailer needs to carry. And this is happening in Europe currently as we speak. So when you need to minimize inventory levels, you start figuring out what products do I need to carry on my shelves, how much of product do I need to carry on my shelves, do I need to, shorten my store footprint, and so on. So it fundamentally impacts your pricing, it impacts, the products, it impacts, the real estate space that you need to operate a storefront in, and so on. It's a far-reaching law in terms of, what's been enacted. And given that, a lot of economists are currently trying to go the austerity manner rather than the more traditional approach of spending more money in, during the economic recession, it's bound to start hitting the U.S. pretty shortly as well in terms of some of these laws to help tighten the belt in terms of the way that operations are run at businesses, including those of retailers. So that's another example of regulation that has far-reaching impact. Another example, is around, data privacy and so on. So data privacy, typically retailers take an inward look and try and figure out, okay, is it PCI DSS, what types of data can I share, what can I not share, what needs to be encrypted on the wire, and so on. But I think retailers have a larger opportunity with some of these laws to actually look beyond their boundaries into what's happening with Facebook, what's happening with Twitter, and so on. And these types of firms have a whole plethora of information about their customer segments and their customer market. Retailers are well advised to actually get hold of some of these types of data to augment their intelligence about customers to serve their markets better. So it's important for retailers to look beyond their boundaries when it comes to data privacy, usage of data, and so on. There was a recent article, not recent, about 6 months old, but Target was able to identify or analyze the data patterns about purchases made by a female buyer and guessed that she was pregnant, and they sent pregnancy-related material to her home. And the dad basically called up and said, hey, my daughter is not pregnant, she's 16 years old, why are you sending me this kind of material? The representative at Target basically responded saying, I'm really sorry, sir, maybe we made a mistake, and so on. So a couple of days later, he actually calls back, apologizes, and says, you guys were right. It's a case where, intelligent use of data can allow a retailer to sense what's happening in their market down to a consumer level and, message to them appropriately. Though in this case, maybe it could have been a week delay, and the dad would have been appreciative of those offers.
Yeah, that was a fantastic example that really hit the news last year. It's a fantastic story. So operations, that's what people spend most of their time worrying about. This is the bread and butter. So I think what we're getting at today is there's a real difference between optimizing your operations and agility. Isn't that really the same thing, right?
It isn't. It's a good question, Bill. It's really not the same thing. I'll give some examples. A retailer that I was working with, I think they had a best-in-class, operations from a transportation standpoint. They exactly knew how many trucks to run, how many runs they had to make between their warehouses and their stores to deliver merchandise. They had reverse logistics figured out and so on. That part of the supply chain was highly optimized, but they did that in isolation, right? So once we start, optimizing in isolation without a view of the global supply chain and a view of what the constraints are, it actually negatively impacts margins. In this case, the pure focus on trying to reduce transportation costs, whether it's fuel, whether it's the number of trucks that are running, so much of focus being put on that single area negatively impacted the way that stores operate and, the products that needs to get carried at the stores. So an example is now the store associates who were, placing orders and trying to figure out how much of quantity do I need to put on my shelves, where actually, had to remember, it became a lot more complicated for them because they had to remember what products to order on what days. They had to remember, how much of time it takes from the time an order was placed to when delivery happens, and they had to start forecasting. So all of this is additional complexity on the part of the stores when, typically the constraint in retail is the shelf space that's available for putting merchandise on. So if you kind of take a broader view of right from a time when ideation happens with the merchandisers to figure out what products to put on the shelves, all the way through to inventory actually hitting the shelves and trying to figure out what the constraints are along the way, that would give a much better view for retailers to optimize the supply chain end-to-end, the global supply chain end-to-end, and thereby become a lot more responsive, right? So if you can do the entire bit faster, then it allows retailers to become a lot more agile in the way that they operate. A classic example is, Kroger, which managed to get this optimization going, and similarly with Zara's as well. So I'll actually take the example of Zara's. Zara's is probably a much better example. Apparel retailing typically works on a seasonal kind of basis, at least for retailers such as Zara's, which are carrying more seasonal merchandise. And most of these retailers try to plan out next season merchandise about a season forward. So 6 months to a year forward, they try and figure this out. What needs to happen in the next cycle. So, what Zara did was try to look at this cycle end-to-end and optimize it to a place where they could respond to changing customer needs, whether it's in terms of the color, whether it's in terms of a specific cut, and they made this happen in a 2-week turnaround. So they looked at the entire process, figured out a point in time where they could separate out making of the fabric and dyeing it to a specific color from the rest of the process, and they optimized, they cut it off at a point where they could get all of the merchandise, all of the fabric ready, and then the rest of the process alone, the customization took a couple of weeks. So they were able to do it extremely well, and that's an example of being agile versus the optimizing on a single localized manner.
All right. So what do we do? How do we get there?
Now, Bill.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. Is what do we do? How do we get there? So let's talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. So, Bill, what are some of the tools, techniques, and processes that that you have seen customers adopt in their quest for agility?
Yeah. So let's start with let's start at the top here. I mean, one of the things you have to have is you have to have information about what's happening around you. There's a lot of change going on, and you need that information. And this is why so many retailers live and die by reports they get, by the data they get. You have no chance of adjusting and adapting quickly without that data. So we're going to talk about that. But there's also some real core technical practices that we'll talk about. You alluded to it earlier with the discussion around your store systems. Can you make those changes quickly? Can you get those price changes into the stores in the same day? We'll talk about that as well, as what you need to do in your tech organization to make that happen. So first, let's talk about the data. Let's talk about the information. Planning, forecasting, decision making. This is all really moving under the rubric of analytics nowadays. So we need to get the right information to the right people. And one of the biggest myths in this space in data management is that you need to do this huge data warehousing effort. You need to get all this data, spend a big amount of effort putting it all together. That's definitely the thinking of the past. For the future, it's amazing what you can do with existing data, existing channels, and getting that into the right hands. Lots of interesting techniques around using information radiators is the term. You can take that data and really make it visible. Imagine broadcasting sales data in break rooms, in the elevators, at corporates. I mean, you can show sales trends, variances with what's expected. You can grab that and show it straight away. So that while planning is obviously important in your business, having the most up-to-date data right away where you need it is far more important. So let's go and talk about the big three. This is people, tools, and process. Really, any conversation around technology, you have to talk about those three. So let's start with people. And what I'd like to talk about here is your IT organization. And one of the trends that many companies have is they get way too siloed. Your people really need to understand the big picture. Do you have teams that never rotate people? Your supply chain team never has anything to do with customer-facing systems. If so, it's wise to mix it up. Sure, you need some specialization to some degree, but it's far more important to have some breadth of exposure. That's really for two reasons. One, it mitigates your risk. I mean, if you have people too focused on an area, then it really increases your risk exposure if they leave to go work elsewhere. If no one knows that system or those tools, you're going to be in big trouble. Number two, there's a real benefit to having folks in the IT organization actually know more than their core specialty. That cross-training can be a real advantage. If you know something about your supply chain, that can be a real advantage in understanding purchasing and pricing, let alone customer experience. So let's move on to some tools. So open standards, open source software, these are not new, but still many retailers are still stuck with a lot of features being used, a lot of big, expensive software licenses that they're paying for. It's not really a great use of your money. There are great open source alternatives. More and more people are using Linux. Great ways to save money. And you're probably not going to use half the features that you're buying anyway for a lot of the tools you're purchasing. Also, it really avoids vendor lock-in. A lot of your infrastructure is becoming commoditized nowadays. And anything you can do to avoid vendor lock-in is a good thing. So we're going to talk about a story on that point a little bit later. A great case study that a company we're working with is being quite thoughtful about that particular problem. Now, processes around software have made great strides in the last 10 years. Specifically, I want to talk about something called continuous delivery. So it's 2012. It's really unacceptable nowadays to wait 9 to 15 months before delivering a system. There's been a lot of progress in the last 10 years. There are tools and techniques nowadays that allows for much more frequent delivery of software. Continuous design, continuous delivery. Your IT teams can make changes to software and get it into production, all the way into production, much more quickly nowadays than even 5 or 10 years ago. Some organizations, not retailers specifically, but some organizations, they actually will update their software several times a day using very small changes in production. So not necessarily that you want to do that, but the ability to do it is very powerful. If you can do that, you can respond to changes very quickly, along the lines that Thad alluded to earlier with doing intraday price changes. So a lot of focus on this area touches on agile software development. So agile software development, it's not new. It's been around for about 10 years. But the last few years, there's been a very large focus on doing sprints or thinking about Scrum. And these are very good things to try and learn how to do. But there's much more at stake here. There's much more that you have to do to be successful. So retailers need to avoid falling into the trap of skipping over the technical enablers of agility. And so there are many technical practices that your teams need to adopt as well. They need unit testing. They need to be able to deploy builds very quickly. They need to automate regression tests. They need to be able to do continuous deployments, quick managing of environments, quick setup of servers, and understanding cloud computing. So there's far more to being agile, having agile development practices than doing sprints. And it's important to make sure that you understand all of them. So if we can do all these things, we're going to have a major impact on our customers. You'll be able to actually change your operational procedures quickly, and you'll be able to try new ideas and respond to change. So the alternative is sticking with the tried and true 9 to 12 month deployments, but no one really wants that. So the future is definitely adopt some of these agile techniques in your IT organization so you can really respond to change quickly. So next, we'd like to move on and talk about some examples of some retailers that we think are really doing a great job in the space.
So Bill, can you talk about how we have helped some of our customers, become a lot more agile?
Sure. I mean, we've been involved in helping some of our customers, but I don't want to take care of the leadership they've provided as well. So we're happy to have played a part in some of these examples. One of the smallest examples that we wanted to start with is a common problem. You've got peak season coming up. You do a review in the summer, and you realize, oh my gosh, our .com site is not fault tolerant. Last year, it went down a few times, lost millions of dollars, and we're concerned that it's just not resilient enough to take us through peak. You figure this out in the summer. What do? Very tough position to be in. So one of our customers, they have a wide variety of products, very large retailer. They set out with a very creative solution, and they said, let's build a parallel version of our site. It will not have all the features of our existing site, but if, and hopefully if, but it became when the site, production site goes down, we'll fail over to the cloud-based alternative, which would let people continue to browse products, continue to interact with the brand. True, you couldn't buy anything yet, but you wouldn't have the embarrassment of site not found or site down for maintenance or whatever the outage message was at the time. So I thought this was a great example of a retailer saying, let's take a step towards a much better infrastructure. So the alternative, there's obviously no alternative to rewrite the entire .com to make it more resilient, but it's a great step to adopt very modern infrastructure. This was cloud-based, very resilient, had the ability to scale up, and it was a great way to experiment with that, but at the same time solve a real business problem that they're facing in peak season. So another example that we're going to touch on here, this is a very different situation. This is a very large European retailer. Tough situation here. 4 chains, this is just a tough problem to solve. This retailer had 4 chains, some of whom had very, very small stores with maybe 1 register, 1 cash register, and maybe 1 or 2 employees, all the way up to much larger stores with a big footprint outside of towns with dozens of cash registers and up to 60, 70 employees. So how do you have an in-source system that handles both of these needs? So tough situation. They tried to work with a package, and that wasn't successful. Time to market was the key here because they also needed to retrofit the stores. So a custom solution was handled using all these agile development techniques that we talked about earlier: test automation, quick time to deployment, big focus on testing. All these things allowed point-of-sale system to go live in the smaller of these chains in an 8-month time period. So it's a very aggressive timeline. But using those agile development techniques and working with a partner, we were that partner, they were able to go live on the timelines they needed, and then the system was fit for purpose to handle the larger stores as well. So that was a particularly exciting and fun example of using these techniques to solve a pretty big problem. So let's move to, Sad, I think you wanted to talk about another European example.
Sure, Bill. So we have spoken about different formats of retailing. So let's pick a grocery retailer and talk about it. Right, so they are one of the largest grocery retailers in Italy, and they were finding that difficult to understand whenever there was an impact on sales or margins or loyalty or satisfaction from customers. What was actually causing these, and how can we respond in a rapid manner? And what we basically enabled working with the retailer was for the retailer to get a much better understanding of what their competitors were doing, what was happening in their stores, how were some of the customer segments responding to changes that they implemented either in assortment planning, promotions, pricing, order management, and so on. We got all this data, which was structured at times, unstructured and other times from a social media standpoint. All of these put together made sense of what was happening and turned it around, in a manner that business could make intelligent decisions on and evolve the way that they operate, either in terms of changing the assortment mix. There could be constraints around what needs to be matchable, not matchable. Could be constraints around what are the competitors doing in terms of their pricing, their own promotions. It could be something that was changing from a customer needs standpoint. Right? So essentially take all this data, make sense of it, turn it around in a manner that business could act on in an intelligent manner, and execute on it effectively as well. Because it's one thing to understand what needs to be done, the other is to execute it effectively and get feedback to alter operations as required. So this is kind of what we enable for a retailer that allowed them to better manage their inventories, figure out which products were more profitable than others, and how much of product they needed to carry on their shelves and what types of products to carry. It allowed them the flexibility to test certain products out in specific areas rather than broad-basing it out, and then expanding it out as required. It allowed the retailer to customize their offerings as to what was required in specific regions, in specific stores, in specific cities. Those were some of the benefits that we were able to deliver for the retailer. that changed their way that they operated, changed the way their margins were being determined. A lot of times it was, let's test something, and then figure out what the margins were when we do the calculation of margins at the end of the quarter or whenever, right? So there was not a clear visibility to what the impact of the change was potentially going to be. And those were some of the tools and techniques that we enabled the retailer with that allowed them to change the way that they operate. So now, Bill, can you give an example, maybe in an apparel domain?
Sure. So one system that one of our customers went live with, it's not the most exciting system. This is a PO management system, but it's another example of how to use great agile techniques to solve a problem. So they were trying to work with a package for over a year and having a very tough time with it. So they abandoned that solution. So they decided to move to custom route, and within 4 months, using a lot of these agile techniques, we had a release ready for production. And the confidence in the customer was so high in the software that they decided to actually release it during peak, which is, as everyone on this webinar knows, it's a very, very tough thing to do. So, but they felt very confident that it would be smooth, it would be easy, and so they decided to go. So deployment was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. As usual, someone had blocked their entire weekend to handle the deployment. Friday at 5 o'clock, they pushed the button to begin the deployment. It was automated so nicely that by 5:05 p.m., the entire system had been deployed. It had been validated in production, and the work was done. So this person who freed up his entire weekend, was kind of confused as to what to do with his time. So it was their weekend back. So, it's a great example of not just how someone can get their weekend back, which is a good thing, but also how you can actually continue to make progress and get things into production, even in those times where normally you assume you can't make any changes. So another example, this is the same retailer. This is clothing retailer. It's a big challenge. They obviously have stores, servers in the stores, and they're moving over time to get inventory management and point of sale to rely on services. Basically, the goal is to have the ability to have changes pushed into the store systems as rapidly as they can be done online. This is the overall challenge. The difficulty, however, is there's an existing vendor for point of sale, there's an existing vendor for the hardware. Both of these things make it a little tough. So over time, they're moving to a set of services that the existing store systems can call, and they're migrating away from that vendor lock-in so that they can really move quickly and adapt to change. So I think that's an exciting example of taking a problem that you'd think, oh, to replace point of sale, you have to do this all at once. But there are clever ways that you can migrate away, and I'm very, very pleased to see that one. So this is in progress, and I'll be excited to see its next steps. So with that, we're going to move on, and we're going to take some questions. So I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us today. And for those of you who are going to stick around for the questions, we've got a few coming in, and we'll respond to them right away. Thank you so much.